Hi, my name is Miriam Fernandez. I'm a faculty member in the English department. I'm also the composition coordinator for our first year composition program. And I am presenting my observations on the assessment of our program. So next, I'm going to focus on the assessment of student writing. Our assessment program or pilot began last year in spring 2021. And this was for the fall 2020 semester. And we were using rubrics that were developed previously by faculty. So the general kind of outline of our assessment plan was to collect as many student samples or student essays as we could, and then assess a small sample using 2 out of the 7 outcomes for one semester. And then the following semester, again, a different 2 out of 7. The third semester, a different 2 out of the 7. And on the fourth semester, we would assess revision, since revision would require that we collect both final drafts and earlier drafts to be able to assess how much revising took place. So we have 7 program learning outcomes, and these are the 7. So for the fall 2020 semester, we were assessing 2 of the 7. We focused on writing as inquiry and critical information literacy. So these are the 2 program learning outcomes that we were focusing on. The rubrics that we used for the fall 2020 assessment essentially look like this. So we have writing as inquiry, and then that gets broken down into 3 parts. And then critical information literacy, that gets broken down into 3 parts. And then in terms of assessing whether or not they fulfilled these parts of the program learning outcome, we had scoring from 0 to 5. So for fall 2020, I collected various student essays, and from a pool of about 50 or 60 essays, I randomly chose 30 student essays. And these were from across, I think, 5 sections of English 1070. Student essays were anonymized, so there were no student names or teacher names. We had 7 faculty who were assessing, 5 on tenure track and 2 lecturers. So all of these faculty are people who have taught English 1070, English 1050, so they were familiar with the curriculum. And they assessed the essays using the rubric from that previous slide. Each essay was read by 2 faculty. That way we could, compare and see if there was any need for norming. And then here are the assessment results. So as I had mentioned previously, each of the program learning outcomes was broken down into 3 parts. And so on this table here, you can see those 3 sections there. So for writing as inquiry, which is the blue line, it kind of is pretty consistent throughout. In terms of inquiry, was an average score of 3.29. So that puts us right at the developing stage. And then for project, 3.24, conversation, 3.22, and a cumulative 3.25. So this sort of gives us a visual of the scores. Same for critical information literacy. In this one, you can see a little bit more variation between those points. And those were the results that we got from that initial fall assessment. So looking back at the assessment process as well as the scores, it seems that based on the small sample size and the assessment of these 2 particular program learning outcomes, it seems that students are meeting the outcomes consistently and as expected. There were some questions that came up as I was looking at the rubrics and the scoring. For one, each of the rubrics breaks down a program learning outcome into 3 distinct parts. And with writing as inquiry, they were pretty similar. which begs the question of, is it necessary to break it down, disaggregate and then re-aggregate the data like that? But with critical information literacy, it did seem to be, valuable to see that. Critical information literacy sort of showed that while students were doing well in terms of locating and using a variety of sources, I think that they scored 3.58 on that area. They were a lot lower scoring for synthesizing those sources, and generally synthesizing is a little bit harder to do. So I wasn't really surprised to see that it did lower on that end, but perhaps by looking at the breakdown of one program learning outcome into 3 different parts, we can get a better sense of where the strengths are and where we need to focus, more attention on a particular aspect, like synthesizing. So there are a couple other things that came up as we were doing this assessment. One of the things that I noticed by gathering all the data, putting it together, I think there's some need for a little bit of norming. Out of 180 data points, that's with 2 readers each, about 40 times or 22% of the time, there was a discrepancy of more than 1 point. So that would be one reader, for example, would give it a 1, meaning it needs improvement. And then the second reader might give it a 3, which was developing, or even 4, well developed. And so when a score is that different, it's hard to say, how accurate that is. That could be, one person assesses, with a different standard in mind. And so, figuring out where that difference is would be important. So having some sort of norming before faculty assess, I think, would help to minimize that discrepancy. And then another aspect was finding faculty to volunteer for assessment. That seemed to be an ongoing issue. And finally, because it is difficult to find volunteers, I'm wondering if it might be better to have assessment happen once a year rather than planning it to happen twice a year. And if we did do something like that, it might be more useful to assess more than 2 program learning outcomes per semester. That way we could get a more accurate picture of changes that might happen year by year. So the thing that I was thinking about was potentially to look at our 7 program learning outcomes, compare them to the general education learning outcomes that they're connected to, and then perhaps find a way of combining them so that we're really only having an assessment of 4 or 5 things as opposed to 7 that we can then do once a year. And that might help the issue of having to find volunteers for assessment every semester. So that's currently my thinking, and I will be, presenting this to the composition committee and other faculty and getting their feedback and their thoughts and seeing how we might improve our assessment, or more like streamline it, right? Because I think that our assessment plan is pretty strong. It's just a matter of making it work a little bit more efficiently. All right, thank you.